For centuries, one of the most haunting symbols of beauty in Chinese history was something few would call beautiful today: bound feet. Known as lotus feet, this tradition changed the lives and bones of millions of women. These feet were tiny, arched, and often broken. They were once seen as the height of feminine beauty and elegance. But beneath the silk shoes and poetic names was a reality full of pain, sacrifice, and lasting damage. Foot binding began when girls were very young, often before the age of 7. It was treated like a rite of passage, marked by bloody bandages and driven by cultural values. Mothers passed it down to daughters with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Some women lived their entire lives limping, enduring, and adapting to this harsh tradition. Yet, foot binding wasn't only about suffering. It was deeply connected to ideas of honor, purity, and social standing. Women who had the ideal 3-inch golden lotus feet were seen as more desirable brides. Beauty and pain were tightly linked, both expected and admired. This strange balance between elegance and agony continues to capture attention today. Although foot binding has disappeared from daily life, it remains one of the most talked about and analyzed customs in Chinese history. Why? Because it shows the power of culture. It reveals how an entire society can support a practice that, from a modern perspective, seems impossible to imagine. This tradition speaks to universal issues: the pressure to fit in, the pain women endure to meet beauty standards, and the way social class can shape personal decisions. Historians, artists, and everyday people still ask, how could such a painful practice last for over 1,000 years? It also brings up deeper questions about gender, control, and identity. While foot binding was unique to China, its themes are global. From corsets in the West to modern beauty surgeries, echoes of foot binding are still around today. Foot binding is not just a piece of history, it's a mirror. It reflects how far we've come as a society and how much we still wrestle with the price of beauty. Foot binding is believed to have started during the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, around 907 to 960 AD. But it really began to spread during the Song Dynasty, from 960 to 1279. While historians still debate its exact origin, most agree that it started in the imperial courts before becoming popular among the wider population. At first, foot binding was something only the elite did. It was found in royal palaces and among wealthy families. In these circles, small feet were seen as a sign of luxury. A woman with bound feet didn't have to work. She could stay indoors, decorate herself, and move slowly with a kind of graceful charm. Over time, this idea made its way into the broader society. What began as a courtly fashion among dancers turned into a common tradition that touched nearly every class of woman in China. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, from 1368 to 1644, and the Qing Dynasty, from 1644 to 1912, foot binding had become deeply rooted in Chinese life. It was considered a normal part of growing up for girls, especially in northern and central regions. Generation after generation grew up knowing no other definition of beauty. One of the most famous stories about the start of foot binding centers on a woman named Yao Nyang, an imperial concubine. According to legend, she was the favorite of Emperor Liu of the southern Tang. She bound her feet into the shape of a crescent moon and performed a mesmerizing dance on a golden lotus-shaped stage. The emperor was so enchanted that he declared, "Lotus springs from her every step." This phrase led to the poetic nickname Golden Lotus for bound feet. Another version of the story tells of Pan Yunu, another imperial consort who danced barefoot on a floor of golden lotuses. These romantic legends helped to soften the harsh reality of foot binding, turning it into something connected with art, love, and beauty. The term golden lotus came to symbolize elegance and mystery. Stories like these helped shape how people viewed the practice. They made it seem less cruel and more refined, tying it to courtly grace and royal admiration. As these legends blended with social expectations, they helped the practice last for centuries. But foot binding didn't develop on its own. It was heavily shaped by Chinese culture, especially Confucian beliefs. At the time, ideas about modesty, obedience, and self-restraint were central to how women were expected to behave. A woman's movement, both physical and symbolic, was supposed to be limited and controlled. Foot binding reinforced these beliefs. It physically kept women closer to the home, in line with the Confucian ideal that praised silence, loyalty, and obedience within the family. Aesthetic standards also played a big role. Chinese art and poetry often praised smallness and fragility in women. Bound feet became a way to show these qualities. As time went on, foot binding became a symbol of social class and cultural identity. It wasn't just about looking beautiful. It was about showing that a woman had discipline, refinement, and knew her place in society. That's why the practice continued, even though it caused so much physical pain. In ancient China, beauty was closely tied to ideas of grace, delicacy, and restraint. Women were admired not for being bold or strong, but for being refined, gentle, and composed. A soft voice, pale skin, slim hands, and above all, tiny feet, were seen as the highest signs of feminine beauty. Bound feet became the centerpiece of this standard. Women with carefully shaped golden lotuses were seen as elegant and desirable. The ideal foot length was just 3 inches, a nearly impossible goal that led to lifelong pain and disability. Yet, society viewed this pain as proof of a woman's devotion to beauty and to her family. Poetry and artwork from the time praised the slow, swaying walk of women with bound feet. It was seen as sensual, modest, and graceful. The suffering wasn't hidden, it was romanticized. A woman's limp wasn't considered a weakness, but a charming detail that enhanced her appeal. Art and literature helped blur the lines between pain and beauty, turning injury into elegance. In this cultural setting, beauty wasn't just about physical appearance, it was about character. A beautiful woman was quiet, obedient, and self-controlled. Her bound feet showed that she had those qualities. Foot binding also marked social status. In rich families, bound feet showed that a girl didn't need to work. She was being raised for marriage, not for labor. So bound feet became a way to display a family's wealth and refinement. For poorer families, binding a daughter's feet was often seen as an investment. A girl with small, well-shaped feet had a better chance of marrying into a higher status family. So foot binding became part of a family's social strategy. But it wasn't just about status, it was also about virtue. Bound feet showed a girl's patience, obedience, and willingness to suffer for her family. These were the traits that made a good wife. Binding the feet meant binding the will, to tradition, to family, and to society's expectations. Confucianism played a powerful role in all of this. It taught that society needed order, and everyone had to know their place. For women, that meant serving their fathers, husbands, and sons with devotion. Foot binding supported this system. It limited women's movement and kept them close to the home. This wasn't seen as a restriction, but as a virtue. A woman who stayed home was doing her duty. The patriarchal structure of Chinese society made foot binding even more accepted. A woman's value came from marriage, childbirth, and family honor. Bound feet became one of the ways her value was measured. Even mothers who had suffered through binding themselves often continued the tradition. They believed it was the only way to give their daughters a chance at a better life. The practice was passed down through generations, wrapped in love, duty, and cultural pressure. In the end, foot binding wasn't just about beauty. It was about control. It was about fitting into a system where suffering was seen as a sign of worth. Foot binding usually began when girls were between 4 and 9 years old, young enough that their bones were still soft and easy to reshape. Starting early was important. The older a girl was, the harder it was to force her feet into the desired shape. Many families chose to begin in autumn or winter. The cold weather helped numb the feet, slightly dulling the pain. Sometimes, the ritual started with a small ceremony. The girl might be given sweets, new clothes, or words of encouragement, masking the agony that was about to follow. The process was brutal, step by step. First, the child's feet were soaked in warm water, often mixed with herbs or even animal blood, to soften the skin and tissue. Then, the toenails were trimmed to avoid infection. In some cases, toenails were removed entirely to prevent them from growing into the skin once the toes were bent. Next came the breaking and folding. The 4 smaller toes were bent underneath the sole of the foot, one by one, until they broke or folded unnaturally. The arch of the foot was then forcefully pushed upward to create a steep curve. Long cloth strips, about 10 feet in length, were tightly wrapped around the feet. These bindings pressed the toes downward and pulled the heel and the ball of the foot closer together. The bandages were sewn into place. Then the girl was made to walk, right away. The pressure of walking helped to break the bones further and mold the feet into the desired shape. This process didn't happen just once. It was repeated daily for months or even years. The The bandages were removed and cleaned often to reduce the risk of infection. But infections were still common, and the goal was always the same: to shrink the feet down to no more than 3 inches. The materials used for binding were usually strips of cotton cloth. Wealthier families sometimes used silk. These strips needed to be strong enough to hold the feet in place, but also breathable to help prevent infection. Herbal pastes were sometimes applied to treat wounds. Alum powder or other antiseptics were used to stop sores from festering. In some places, wooden shoes or iron molds helped shape the feet. Scissors, knives, and needles were kept nearby, not as medical tools, but for cutting bandages or draining pus from infections. The pain was intense and constant. Bones cracked, skin tore, and toes often turned black. In some cases, toes rotted and fell off. A few girls died from gangrene or blood poisoning. For most, the pain never completely went away. Long-term, the damage was permanent. Women with bound feet lived with chronic pain. They had trouble walking, standing, or balancing. Their knees and hips often became deformed. Falls were common in old age. Some women lost their ability to walk entirely. Despite this, families, especially mothers and grandmothers, kept the ritual going. Many believed they were helping their daughters have a better future. Girls learned to cope in different ways. Some were rewarded with treats for being brave. Others were told stories about beautiful women with golden lotuses, giving them something to hope for. Pain was expected. Crying was discouraged. Silence was praised. In wealthy homes, girls were pampered during the binding years. They were carried by servants, and their feet were massaged. In poor families, girls still had to work, carrying water, feeding animals, even while suffering. In some areas, professional foot binders were hired. These were usually older women who had experience with the process. They knew how to break bones just right and could recognize the early signs of infection. Their skills were passed down like a trade, but often the process stayed within the family. Mothers bound their daughters' feet the same way their own mothers had done. Some wept while doing it. Others steeled themselves, believing they were doing the right thing. Even with all the cruelty, foot binding was seen not as violence, but as an act of love and responsibility. For women with bound feet, pain was a constant companion. Every movement had to be careful and controlled. Walking became a slow, swaying motion, which was oddly viewed as elegant and attractive. But behind that graceful appearance was a reality filled with discomfort and struggle. Simple daily tasks became major challenges. Climbing stairs, carrying water, or looking after children required extra effort or outside help. Many women leaned on canes or walls to keep their balance. As they got older, falls became more common because of weak muscles and unstable footing. Still, life had to go on. Despite their pain, these women managed households, raised children, and especially in poorer communities, contributed to their family's survival. Their ability to keep going, even with limited mobility, showed remarkable strength and resilience. Marriage was one of the biggest reasons families chose to bind a daughter's feet. Well-bound feet were considered a girl's greatest asset when looking for a husband. Matchmakers inspected feet the way others might judge fine jewelry, examining their shape, size, and symmetry. In many places, smaller feet meant better marriage opportunities. Tiny, well-shaped feet showed that a girl came from a family that followed tradition and had high standards. They also signaled that she could endure hardship, a trait considered valuable in a wife. Girls with unbound or loosely bound feet were often looked down upon. In some regions, a girl with large, natural feet might only marry a laborer or could even remain single. The pressure to conform didn't just affect the girl, it weighed heavily on her entire family. Women with bound feet faced major limits when it came to physical labor. In the countryside, where help was always needed on farms and around the home, this was a big issue. Some families delayed binding or did it more loosely so girls could still work. Then, they might try to tighten the bindings later to improve her chances for a good marriage. In cities, where foot binding was more strictly followed, women often stayed indoors. They focused on embroidery, weaving, or managing the home, tasks that didn't require walking or standing for long periods. Even so, many women found ways to adapt. The idea that all women with bound feet were helpless isn't entirely true. They often adjusted to their situation and found creative ways to get things done. The voices of women who lived through foot binding reveal the emotional side of the tradition. Some described it with sadness and regret. Others, surprisingly, spoke with pride. To them, their bound feet were symbols of strength, endurance, and proper womanhood. In interviews from the 20th century, elderly women spoke about the sharp, lasting pain they still felt. Some remembered their mothers crying while binding their feet, torn between cultural duty and love. Many expressed sorrow when they saw younger generations able to walk freely and go to school. But not all stories were filled with regret. One woman from Yunnan province said, "If my feet were not bound, I could not have married. And then, what kind of life would I have had?" These personal stories show how complex foot binding really was. For many, it wasn't just a painful tradition, it was also tied to identity, pride, and survival in a society that gave women very few choices. Foot binding was practiced across much of China, but the way it was done, and how strictly it was followed, varied widely between different regions and social groups. In cities and among the wealthy elite, foot binding was almost universal, and often the most extreme. These were the communities where beauty, refinement, and tradition were valued most. Girls from these families had their feet bound tightly and consistently, often achieving the highly praised 3-inch golden lotus. Families with money could afford to keep girls indoors and away from physical labor, which made it easier to maintain the ideal foot shape. In contrast, rural areas were more flexible. Foot binding was still common, but it was often done less tightly to preserve a girl's ability to help with work. In farming communities, girls were needed in the fields to carry water or to tend animals. Some families delayed binding until girls were older. Others bound the feet more loosely or rebound them occasionally to maintain the shape. In the poorest families, foot binding was sometimes skipped altogether because survival depended on strong, able-bodied women. Still, even in the countryside, cultural pressure remained strong. A girl with unbound feet risked social judgment and had fewer marriage options. The fear of being left behind in marriage often pushed families to follow the tradition, even if it made daily life harder. The style and technique of binding also changed over time and across dynasties. During the Song dynasty, the focus was on high arches and slightly curved feet. These were delicate, but not necessarily extremely small. By the Qing dynasty, the standard had become more extreme. The goal was a very small, sharply arched foot with the toes folded under, a painful shape that became the most admired. Different regions developed their own customs. In northern China, where the Han ethnic majority lived, foot binding was more common and strictly practiced. But even among Han communities, local differences in shoe style and binding technique reflected regional identity. In the south, places like Fujian and Guangdong had more ethnic diversity. Some minority groups there rejected foot binding or adapted it differently. For example, among the Hakka people, foot binding was rare or not done at all. Hakka women were expected to work in agriculture, so bound feet would have been a burden. The Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty also took a different approach. They officially banned foot binding among their own women. Instead, Manchu women wore special flower bowl shoes. These shoes had thick soles that created a swaying walk similar to that of bound feet, mimicking the effect without the pain. Local traditions shaped the look and meaning of foot binding. In some regions, feet were compared to willow leaves or bowls. In others, poetic names like silver lotus, fragrant petals, or tender moon were used. These unique names and styles show how deeply foot binding was woven into cultural identity, even as it varied from place to place. Although foot binding was deeply rooted in Chinese society, it was never without its critics. Even during its most popular periods, some people spoke out against it. These voices included scholars, poets, and religious figures, especially some Buddhists and Taoists, who questioned whether such a painful practice was truly moral or necessary. Some Confucian scholars argued that changing the natural body, especially in such a violent way, went against the idea of filial piety, which teaches that one should not harm the body given by one's parents. Others focused on the suffering of young girls and the long-term harm it caused, especially when it led to permanent disability. One of the earliest efforts to stop foot binding came during the Qing dynasty from the Manchu rulers. In 1645, Emperor Xuanzhi issued a ban on the practice for Han Chinese. However, it didn't work. The custom was already too deeply embedded in society. Later, Emperor Kangxi even lifted the ban, admitting that foot binding was too firmly established to be ended by decree. Throughout the Qing period, criticism of foot binding continued, but it remained weak and largely ignored. The Manchu women themselves did not bind their feet. Instead, they wore flower bowl, shoes that gave the illusion of a bound foot walk. This showed that alternatives were possible, but for most Han Chinese families, giving up foot binding still felt unthinkable. A stronger wave of opposition came from outside China. When Christian missionaries arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, and more forcefully in the 19th, they were shocked by the practice. They saw it as cruel and backward. Many took in orphaned or abandoned girls and raised them with unbound feet, offering them a different life through Christian teachings and education. Missionaries like Adele Fielda worked directly against foot binding by creating schools for girls. These schools taught reading, writing, and useful skills, giving girls other ways to succeed besides marriage. Westerners also wrote pamphlets and books criticizing the practice and helped form anti-foot binding societies that joined with Chinese reformers. By the late 19th century, Chinese intellectuals and reformers were speaking out more forcefully. Their motivation often came from nationalism. Many worried about how China looked to the rest of the world. Foot binding became a symbol of everything holding China back. Kang Yue was one of the most important voices in this movement. In 1894, he founded the Anti-Foot Binding Society. By 1898, it had over 10,000 members. He submitted a petition to the emperor, saying that foot binding made women weak, which made their children weak, and by extension weakened the nation. After the Boxer Rebellion in 1902, the Qing court started supporting reforms, including efforts to end foot binding. In 1903, Genie published the Women's Tocsin, the first major manifesto calling for women's liberation in China. He called foot binding one of the 4 greatest harms done to women in traditional society. Female reformers like Qiu Jin and Ding Ling also began to speak out. They saw foot binding as both a physical and emotional form of control. They wrote articles, gave speeches, and founded schools for girls where foot binding was not allowed. By 1908, most of Chinese public opinion had turned against the practice. Foot binding started to fade quickly after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The 1912 nationalist revolution carried the ban forward, and anti-foot binding campaigns became more effective than ever before. Still, it's important to note that many reformers weren't only concerned about women's health. Some of them accepted Western views that looked down on traditional Chinese customs. They believed that freeing women from foot binding was necessary to make China a modern and respected nation. Change didn't happen overnight. Many families continued the practice, especially in the countryside. But by the early 20th century, what was once seen as honorable began to be viewed as shameful. The same tradition that had shaped women's lives for centuries was finally losing its power. After the 1911 revolution, the newly formed Republican government officially banned foot binding in 1912. Unlike earlier attempts, this ban was part of a larger plan to modernize China. Social attitudes were starting to shift, and more people supported change. By 1915, the government was enforcing the ban more seriously, even handing out fines to those who continued the practice. These anti-foot binding efforts were very effective. At first, they were led by foreign Christian missionaries and Chinese intellectuals, who helped remove the cultural pride once attached to bound feet. But by the Republican era, Chinese leaders had taken full control of the movement. This gave it more power and made it more acceptable to the public. The campaign used education, social pressure, and laws all at once. Anti-foot binding societies encouraged families to sign pledges promising not to bind their daughters' feet or allow their sons to marry women with bound feet. This mix of moral arguments and practical action helped shift opinions quickly. During the 1920s and 1930s, many provinces passed their own local bans. While these weren't always enforced equally, especially in rural areas, they sent a strong message. More and more people began to see foot binding as outdated and harmful. Education played a key role. As more girls went to school, especially in cities, they were taught about the dangers and long-term effects of foot binding. Teachers became important voices in the movement, presenting natural feet as symbols of progress, health, and patriotism. At the same time, the image of women in Chinese society was changing. Women were going to school, working, and becoming more active in public life. Bound feet didn't fit the new idea of what a modern woman should be. These shifts in attitude happened fast. In Dingxian, a region south of Beijing where almost every woman once had bound feet, studies showed that no new bindings had been reported among girls born after 1919. This shows how quickly and completely social norms can change when education, law, and public opinion all align. Still, the end of foot binding didn't happen overnight. Many families held on to the tradition out of habit, fear, or concern for their daughters' futures. But with each new generation, fewer and fewer girls were subjected to the binding process. In some rural areas, the practice quietly continued into the 1940s and even the early 1950s. But after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, foot binding was banned once and for all. The new communist government strictly enforced this law. Foot binding was seen as a symbol of feudalism and oppression, something that had no place in the new China. Government workers visited villages, unwrapped bindings, and inspected feet. Women were encouraged, and often pressured, not to bind their daughters' feet. Propaganda posters and public speeches condemned the practice and promoted the image of a strong, healthy, modern Chinese woman. By the 1960s, foot binding had almost completely disappeared. Young girls no longer had their feet bound. The last generation of women who experienced the practice grew old quietly, their deformed feet a fading reminder of a vanished world. Today, only a few elderly women with bound feet are still alive. They are living links to a tradition that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. The disappearance of foot binding is considered a rare success story. At a time when China faced many challenges, it managed to eliminate a deeply rooted cultural practice in a single generation, proving that meaningful change is possible, even when it seems impossible. For women who had their feet bound, the damage didn't stop when the bindings came off. Years, even decades, of pressure on their bones, muscles, and joints caused permanent deformities. Many of these women walked with a limp or shuffle for the rest of their lives, often unable to stand or balance without help. Chronic pain was common, and it lasted well into old age. Medical studies of elderly women with bound feet have revealed the toll it took on their bodies. Their feet often had collapsed arches, fused toes, bone spurs, and poor circulation. Some were missing toes because of infections they had suffered as children. Arthritis was widespread. The way they walked also affected their knees, hips, and lower backs, causing problems with posture and even the positioning of internal organs. Even after unbinding, the body couldn't go back to normal. But the effects weren't just physical, they were emotional too. Many women carried the memory of foot binding with them for life. For those who had started the process as young girls, often between ages 4 and 7, the trauma left a deep impression. At an age when most children are playing and learning, these girls were enduring daily pain and pressure to stay silent and still. Some women later described feelings of betrayal. Their mothers and grandmothers had been the ones to bind their feet, often out of love and concern for their futures. For some, this created a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Others remembered being teased or isolated, or being afraid they wouldn't find a husband if their feet weren't bound perfectly. And yet, not all memories were filled with regret. Some women spoke with pride. Their bound feet had helped them marry, gain respect, and maintain their family's honor. As they aged, many found it painful to hear their experiences dismissed as simply oppression. Their feet, though damaged, were tied to their identity and sense of worth in a society that offered them few choices. This complicated emotional legacy made many women reluctant to speak about their feet, even to doctors. They often kept their stories to themselves. For some, the trauma became part of their private world, endured in silence. Today, foot binding is remembered as both a tragedy and a tradition. It stands as a symbol of the extreme pressure women have faced to meet cultural ideals. But it also tells a story of strength, sacrifice, and survival. It reminds us that beauty standards, once accepted as normal, can carry deep costs. In China, museums help preserve this history. The Chinese Foot Binding Culture Museum in Wuzhen and the Jianchuan Museum are just two examples. They display tiny embroidered shoes, binding cloths, and personal belongings that bring this history to life. These exhibits are both educational and emotional. They help people understand the full reality of what foot binding meant, not just what it looked like. Outside of China, museums like the British Museum and the Museum of Chinese in America have also featured exhibits on foot binding. These displays help people around the world see the practice in context, beyond stereotypes. Oral history projects have played a major role in keeping these women's voices alive. Survivors like Wang Lifan and Zhou Guozian have shared their stories, describing the rituals, the pain, and the lifelong impact. Some felt pride at fitting into the smallest shoes. Others spoke of lost freedom and missed opportunities. Books like Splendid Slippers by Beverly Jackson and Every Step a Lotus by Dorothy Coe have brought these voices to a wider audience. They show the human side of history, the emotions, memories, and meaning behind what might otherwise seem like just another old tradition. As the last generation of women with bound feet pass away, their stories are more important than ever. They are not just part of the past, they are a reminder of what culture can do, for better or worse. Modern Chinese women, many just a generation or two removed from these experiences, carry this history with them. Some feel sorrow, others feel curiosity. Artists, writers, and scholars continue to explore what foot binding meant and what it still means today. Foot binding is gone, but its shadow remains. It teaches us about the high price of beauty, the power of tradition, and the strength it takes to challenge the world's expectations. The story of foot binding is one of pain, endurance, and quiet strength. For nearly 1,000 years, it shaped the lives of millions of women, leaving deep marks on their bodies, their emotions, and Chinese history as a whole. It's easy to look back and see foot binding as cruel, even unthinkable. But the truth is more complicated. Families believed they were doing the right thing, giving their daughters a better future, helping them marry well, and ensuring their place in society. Women accepted the pain because their identity, their value, and often their survival depended on it. Understanding foot binding means looking beyond judgment. It means seeing the full picture, the love, the fear, the duty, and the enormous cultural pressure that made the practice so hard to let go. This history teaches us powerful lessons. It shows how deeply beauty standards can take root, and how much people are willing to endure to meet them. It shows how harmful traditions are passed down, not through hate, but through care and concern. And it shows that even practices that seem unchangeable can be undone through education, awareness, and collective will. Although foot binding ended decades ago, the questions it raises are still with us. Around the world, women still face pressure to reshape their bodies, to fit into narrow definitions of beauty, and to sacrifice for the sake of acceptance. The tools may have changed, such as corsets, high heels, and cosmetic surgery, but the pattern is familiar. Foot binding may be a part of the past, but it continues to echo in the present. It reminds us that the cost of acceptance can be painfully high, and it encourages us to think more critically about the ideals we follow today. By remembering and studying this tradition, we honor the women who endured it, not just by retelling their stories, but by working toward a world where dignity, freedom, and beauty are no longer at odds. For more details on this topic, check out the corresponding article on our website. You can find the link in the description below. Thanks for watching.